questions out there?
Particularly for the new carver apartments, I'm just wondering how you were able to sort of establish the barrier between the role of safety within the apartment as there's the courtyard. It seems as if there's a lot of public space within this part. How do you accommodate for the role of safety?
Part of safety is, I mean,
Go back to the.
yeah, maybe we just go back. I would say that there's like conventional ways to establish a notion of safety, and typically the way that safety is expressed from a kind of control standpoint is through fences and borders and gates and very very obvious physical barriers to prevent the outside from entering. And that's actually quite a good question, because I think in architecture we're always looking in a way to open up dialogue and to open up relationships rather than to close them off. And so in this case, it's a sort of a balance between having visibility, but also having controlled points for people to access. So in this case, the ground floor is set up almost like these series of internal blocks that are separated by these kind of glass storefronts that are open to the street. But in terms of accessing the building, you have to go through the entrance here. And by going through the entrance there, you actually are next to a kind of control point that's visually accessible. But it's not done in a way that's kind of panoptic and sort of controlling. It's really about being conscious about sight lines, being conscious about opening up spaces, but also being very focused about how you imagine people coming into the space and being able to protect people from whatever sort of safety issues exist outside. And then once you pass that point, then when you move further up the building, the idea is to try to open it up. Try to open it up to the city, open it up to activities, to break up the kind of repetitiveness with creating social spaces that are easily accessible by the individuals. So when you talk about actually these kind of social spaces, it's also about the convenience. To be able to, if you live in a particular unit, to be able to be close to some sort of a garden space that might be elevated up, or that's not something that you have to go 20 stories down, but that you can start to consider how these kind of social spaces could be distributed vertically or throughout the building. Like in the same way that the last project with this kind of linear building, even though it's you're dealing with a repetitive system, how you arrange it and the spaces that you create around it becomes an opportunity to look at different types of spaces, whether they're for small groups or for large gatherings.
Thank you very much, Steve. I think all four projects are actually quite outstanding. They share some consistency, and I think many of them, in many aspects, each of them actually represent the thesis in itself. I'm particularly interested in the Star Apartments building. Can you go back to the photos and tell us a bit more about the space between the floating blocks and the old base? I think that is very the finishing one. Yes, this one. Can you talk a bit about? I think this will be very inspiring to students who are about to deal with this kind of place.
Right. Well, as I mentioned, I think these projects are I think less interesting as isolated objects, but more interesting as a kind of a storyline and a series of ideas that have been developed from the first one, which was Rainbow Apartments. Then there was Carver Apartments, and then leading to this one. And so with each housing project, we learned certain things. We learned what worked, what didn't work, in the process. And originally starting out with, how do you create a sense of space and how do you create a sense of safety? And I showed the image of the Toulouse, which is in a way, this kind of prototypical form of a courtyard building. And in a way, that's where we started. And so we started out as this kind of courtyard idea. It was very simple, bringing back something, a kind of a historic typology that has always been very effective as a kind of condenser for community. But by the third project, we started to look at ways in which that concept could be kind of turned on its side in a way, and to recognize that, particularly in Los Angeles, where it's not like in Hong Kong where it's just dense everywhere. The problem in this context is actually the opposite, which is that there's no density and there's no there, and therefore you need to kind of create your site. You have to create your context. In this case, the context was this one-story building, and a pretty unexceptional one-story building. And
Just
so,
can't see it before.
so it's sort of like almost like a game, sort of a found object sort of game where it actually doesn't matter what it is, but it's just okay. You take that as a problem, and then you look at what the opportunities are in the site, and you realize that actually the most compelling aspect of this site is actually not the ground, but actually when you get further up. So you can see in this case where it's not a particularly attractive street experience.
Is there a shopping mall next to it? It's huge. The one, the roof car parking one, the flat one.
This one?
Yeah, it's huge. What is it? Do you remember?
I don't know. It's probably not very interesting, but it's,
It's gigantic, I think.
yeah. So
The scale.
So actually, sort of the emptiness of the context was the most compelling and frustrating part of the project, and through that frustration, we thought that the most uninteresting part of the housing is actually the unit.
Probably, yeah.
And so in a way we're looking at, well, how do you try to make that the most efficient, the cheapest, easiest component, building block, and at the same time work with the existing condition. And then what you're left with is all of the more important aspects, which is the kind of community and social spaces that tie it together. And then we develop this kind of armature in the middle, this kind of device that would essentially tie the two pieces together, and that piece was actually what the project was really about. It was just the void that you create.
So that void,
Sorry, you go.
so that void, the void between the floating clusters
Yeah.
and the original podium or
Yeah.
base plinth of the project is actually a public space.
Yes.
Everybody-
Yes. So I'll go to, yeah, so this is a view of the sort of circulation from the street, and then this is a view of this kind of space in the middle.
So it's not just the residents who are entitled to use it, so other members of the public can also have free access to it.
Well, I think that's where you think about the kind of software of the space, which is the activities. So I think that's also an important thing to consider in housing and social spaces, is the kind of events and the way that events could have some connection with the community and to be able to bring the community into the space, but done in a very controlled way. So, so I think in this sense, you could create this public connection from the street to this upper level, and then from this upper level, you could have a variety of activities. So that, I think in a Hong Kong context, that would be quite interesting, because you're dealing with a much bigger scale, but also potentially a much more diverse set of activities that you can infuse in the space. Like here we have, I mean, it's a small building, so, I mean, particularly small in a Hong Kong context, but you have basketball courts, running tracks, gardens, multifunction spaces, supportive services, and these kind of interesting sort of circulation elements that have to kind of tie between the upper level and the lower level.
So yeah, I think it's particularly successful in terms of what you can told us about this kind of intensifications of the otherwise quite blank and activeness context. So this project, I think, as an image, and these sections and this, it's actually, I haven't been there, but I think it would be a very exciting project.
Yeah.
It's kind of particularly smart and achieved the kind of quality in a very expensive way.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that you don't particularly concerned about the super aesthetics of the facades.
Right.
It's like something that is very urban driven. With these kind of profiles, these clusters, these villages floating. So this I think is a very inspiring thing that students actually look to learn from.
Well, I think the, oh, sorry.
I love the way you explained it. It's totally opposite of Hong Kong. You're trying to create a community from nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the ground floor shop, but now you're creating something about and generating life and dynamic into the area. You know, which is very different from Hong Kong. From Hong Kong, so everything is there, and then you have to connect it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different stories behind each of these projects. Like the first project, Rainbow Housing, you know, this was you know, the first project, and always the first project is the most difficult. But it kind of, the backstory to this was that actually there's an existing building next to on the left side of this, and so actually the form of the building was about essentially completing the square with the existing building, which actually is here. It's a pretty unacceptable building next to it.
Sorry, which one?
And there's this kind of this building next door to it.
And it's not drawn on the plan.
It's not drawn on the plan. It should be.
So it's like B. Watch out.
So actually,
It's like B.
this is one
You
of
see
those
how
kind
people
of
resolved it.
this is one of those graphic representation problems that you should be considered in your presentation.
Yeah,
It's like,
you see? Watch out.
Always draw the context.
always draw the context.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
sorry, Stephen.
yeah. It shows up on the ground floor, which I didn't show. But each of these projects are very contextual,
Very good.
and they maybe moved from sort of more about trying to express ideas to kind of registering, in this case, the kind of forces outside, like the freeway. And in part, an interesting kind of start of this project was we were trying to. We actually started out with a perfectly circular building, and the problem was that we just couldn't fit all the units into the circular building, and we were fighting and fighting and fighting, and at a certain point we just gave up. And then by allowing it to kind of unravel, it suddenly started to make sense from a contextual standpoint.
I think it's very nice.
So in a way, it's also a kind of a caution for you in terms of any sort of a priori idea about what your project is about, because sometimes And following this, moving towards Star Apartments, where it almost is a kind of a sort of a chess game with the context, where, you know, in most cases you would look at that one-story building and you'd say this is completely you know an unexceptional building. Let's just tear it down and build something new. But in that case, it was like, well, actually, you know, hold on a minute and let's see, you know, what is this context really about, and how do we interpret this context in a different way? And so it also talks about a certain environmental approach and an efficient approach, not only to putting the most in terms of the economics of the building to the most important spaces of the building, and letting those other aspects that are functional and efficient be as efficient and functional as they need to be.
Just a little curiosity.
Yeah.
This name's a Star Rainbow. Is it nicknamed or is it really the official name of the project?
Well, I didn't. Those were names that were from the developer. But you know, it's Los Angeles, so you know it's got to have a slightly flashy.
And this is not La Maison or something like that, like Hong Kong.
Oh right.
They always use those.
No, they have those in LA as well, like Palazzo, and, the garden or the.
Okay.
Okay, maybe one last question. Yes.
You speak of a bit of Chinese.
I want to ask, how do you normally transform your design, like idea or concept into a specific form, or like how do you sample the final space or communal space that you want to use? Like, do you normally choose the best case from several experiments?
So the question is about process.
The one clients chose.
Well, yeah, I think obviously process is determined by time and by clients and construction, but usually it's a. For me, it's about looking at a problem from many different scales and many different angles. And so there's the intuitive aspect, and sometimes the intuition is right and sometimes it's wrong. But there's always something in the intuition, but not necessarily leading you to the right solution. And there's always a kind of a battle between time and sort of chasing through ideas until you kind of understand the problem. And often it's really just having enough time to kind of cycle through different ways to look at projects before you really kind of understand what the real project is. So in terms of specifics, I look at it obviously from understanding of the context, or really exploration of not only the physical context, but the social and the historical context. Understanding the kind of typology and how I'm interested in kind of evolving that typology, or looking at different ways to bring variety and diversity into a project. I mean, for me, it's not about what it looks like, although obviously, aesthetics are important. But it's about a kind of generosity. It's about kind of bringing being as inclusive in the ideas that form the architecture.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Is there one more that you want to ask?
Oh,
Last one.
it's if you go back to the section of the star apartment.
So there'll be loads
I
of
would like to
them coming
ask,
out.
because the upper section and the lower section seems a bit not connecting to each other. Is it your intention because of security reasons or other such factors?
Sorry?
Speak up.
Because the upper section and the lower section seems to be somehow disconnected. Is it your intention in drawing this, or is it your intention in your design, or is it not like this?
The question is about the,
The connection, I think I heard that. There's a separation here, he thinks. There's no connection.
right.
Vertical connection, set an intention.
Well,
For the residents.
partly this is where the section was cut, and also it shows the kind of superstructure that was required to set up this arrangement, because actually this is like a big transfer slab, so it's like essentially a kind of giant tray that has these kind of stacked blocks on it. So part of the desire was this space. In a traditional way, you'd have columns just cutting up the space. So in order to kind of make this more column free, you end up having to create these very deep spaces. But in terms of the vertical connection, there's other areas where there's vertical connections. But in this case, it was really the main idea was this kind of structural solution to create this kind of public area in between.
Yeah, this is, I think, the type 5 construction where you have a thick concrete slab and above it are all timber. It's all wood construction.
In fact, this is very common in Hong Kong, if you notice it. All the transfer.
Yeah,
It's like a big
yeah,
town.
a few super column to service states, right? That can actually.
Diagonal.
Right. So here you see some conventional columns, but then you see these kind of sort of super columns
Yeah.
that also serve as emergency exits for the building.
I don't think it's actually quite sensible because there's also a layer of privacy that want to be protected for the residents as well. I think with these clear segregations, they actually intensify the level of activity at this floating ground level. So I think it's also this is so enjoyable. This tracking system, I think it's well strategized in terms of the section arrangement.
Yeah, it's also limited by the existing condition, obviously, because we're dealing with this kind of existing one-story building, so we're quite limited. But I think when you sort of take the existing conditions and you really try to work with them, you actually arrive at some very interesting directions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Maybe the last question is.
So let's ask about how do you define the growth of the, you call it the communities. What do you think about the growth of these communities in a large context in LA? Are you trying to achieve something like the research you have in Barcelona and California? Or are you trying to achieve limits? Or what are you trying to define the communities in this project?
Well, I think for me, architecture is not. I look at architecture as much more of an active agent in the process, in the dialogue of these questions. It's not something that's like a passive container to serve a kind of necessarily commercial need, although it has to serve as a commercial need. But that it, through arrangement and through sort of a spatial configuration and arrangement of spaces, it starts to point at kind of different ways of interacting. And also